Fred Wagner was former chief counsel to the U.S. Federal Highway Administration, and he is now an environmental attorney and a partner in the law firm of Venable LLP. Fred, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to see you.
I want to talk about infrastructure funding, specifically in relation to this new House bill that's running around at the moment. We're going to find out or talk about the prospects for that. But first, I want to ask you just generally, how do you read the current political climate for the passage of any kind of infrastructure funding bill this year?
From a political standpoint, the climate is still very negative. It's very difficult to see the Democrats and the Republicans getting together for a bill that would give the incumbent a victory on this issue, plus the intervening issues related to additional COVID relief, I think are going to be a much higher priority in the short term before the recess for the general election. So there'll be a lot of talk about it, and I think there'll be a lot of competing proposals coming out of Congress as the Republicans now have to respond to some of the Democratic proposals, but the prospects for passage still remain pretty small.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom anytime you're in the last year of an administrative term is that nothing gets done in an election year. But boy, you pile on all the other stuff that's going on right now, and it becomes even more serious. But let's talk for a moment, though, about this Invest in America Act that's come out of the House. It's a proposal that's been criticized. What do you think about that particular proposal?
The proposal that first came out of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is a hybrid, trying to move forward infrastructure spending, enhancing the spending for the traditional surface transportation elements, but then also goes beyond that with additional priorities in terms of green infrastructure, in terms of electrification, in terms of climate and resiliency. So it's not your typical highway extension bill, because it adds a little bit more than that to it. But it was the attempt to do that. As you know, it got put in together with the larger $1.5 trillion package that was passed in the House. So the Invest in America Act is just one piece of that. And then the broader spending package has many, many more elements to it besides just surface transportation. So there's sort of echoes of what we've seen in the past from the FAST Act, from MAP 21, but then also a little bit further enhancement with respect to some of the more green infrastructure and electrification priorities for the Democrats.
Well, despite the use of the word quote-unquote trust fund in the highway trust fund, as I'm sure you know, highway funding has always had to compete with a number of other interests that fall under the category of transportation. We're getting down to the point of like bike paths and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So would you say that the competing interests right now are even more than they used to be, or is it just the same old story of just having to fight for a limited number of dollars? You've got public transit, you've got commercial transit, you've got bicycles, you've got all kinds of things, you've got environment. Is it an extraordinarily complex situation now, or is this just the way it's always been?
I think it's the way it's always been. I think what you're seeing is a reflection in the proposal that passed of a different priority, just balancing priorities a little bit differently. There's huge increases for both highway and transit, but the transit increases even more. And there's additional increases for environmental measures, but there are existing programs under the Federal Highway Administration, under the FTA, across the U.S. Department of Transportation that promote some of those programs already. This just is more like on steroids, if you will. So the House program is pretty generous for both highway and transit, but like I said, it reorients some of the priorities to be more heavily oriented, I think, towards the transit and livable, walkable community side of the ledger. But there's still plenty of dollars in the proposal for traditional highway programs.
Yeah, as you know, of course, there have been many legislative attempts that have at least given lip service to the need for serious money being directed to infrastructure maintenance and repair. And yet when it comes down to where that money is going to come from, it's another story. The Highway Trust Fund has been the source of funds for most of this over the years, and yet it hasn't had a raise in terms of the amount of money that's drawn per mile from gasoline sales for a long, long time. Do you believe that the Highway Trust Fund is a viable means of funding going forward, or are we going to have to find some other way to pay for all this?
I think we're going to have to find another way, and I think the INVEST Act previews some of that by a more aggressive posture towards a vehicle miles traveled fee
Hmm.
It expands the pilot program so that all states can now participate in that to see if that could advance a more reliable source of funding. And that makes a lot of sense because to the extent that the act also promotes electrification, well, then you want to capture the highway users who right now aren't paying those fees through the traditional gasoline tax. And so if the Congress wants to stick to the more historical notion of a user fee, then we need to capture all users, whether they're buying gasoline or whether they're recharging at home or electric charging stations around the country. So
Right.
the movement towards the VMT, I think, is real. I think this act represents opportunities to move in that direction, to get data, to see how it works, and to test the viability of the consumer's acceptance of that protocol for collecting instead of paying at the pump.
Vehicle miles traveled, I believe it was there was an experiment in Oregon. Was there not? Is that still underway? Was that a limited thing? And how did that play out in terms of success?
It's happened in several different forms. The last couple of reauthorization bills have authorized pilot programs, so states could raise their hand and say, us, we'd like to try. Oregon was one of those states.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is that it has been successful, and that was the foundation of allowing other states to join in and to do the same sort of thing. Now, I can't give you chapter and verse in here in terms of an estimate of how the VMT would compare to the gasoline tax. In other words, I think they were just talking about in Oregon things, how would it work? The process for making it work, the acceptance for consumers on making it work, those sorts of things. I don't know if they've gotten to the point of saying, okay, extrapolating this out to a broader community, the VMT would collect X dollars as opposed to the gasoline tax, which would collect Y dollars. I don't think they've
Right.
gotten to that point. But there's been so many practical obstacles, never mind which, the biggest of which is the consumer saying, will we want to do this? Do we feel comfortable with our VMT being tracked this way?
Yeah.
And I think the more you see tolling, the more you see toll facilities, easy pass type technology becoming more ubiquitous around the country, I think the consumer is getting more comfortable with the notion that, yes, you can track where I'm going because
Mm-hmm.
you see every time I pass a toll gantry, but also you can track the quantity of how much I'm driving in addition to where I'm driving. If
Yeah.
people are comfortable with that and some of the privacy issues associated with it, the notion of VMT becomes a lot more palatable to be applied across the country.
Given the fact that anyone who owns a smartphone, which is just about everybody these days, is already being tracked almost every minute of the day, it's kind of ironic that they would, put up a barrier in terms of that. But what about the environmental aspect? As concerns about climate change come to the fore this time around, the argument over infrastructure, do you think it'll play a bigger role? And if so, how will that affect funding? How will that affect priorities? And how will that affect the feasibility of getting something out of Congress and actually approved?
I think it's going to manifest itself in several ways. Most importantly, I think it's going to manifest itself in the resiliency aspects of infrastructure. There's going to be a much greater emphasis on the types of projects that are being built to ensure that they are hardened for potential future climate effects. And I think there's general consensus that that is an acceptable dedication of federal dollars because people want to know that if you're building or repairing a facility, it can and will survive the effects of climate moving forward. And from what I've seen from an engineering perspective, from a funding perspective, there's support for the notion of resiliency or hardening existing and improved infrastructure. So you're going to see it in that perspective. You're also going to see it in terms of engineering concepts. From an environmental perspective, as you know, when you do a major project, you have to consider alternatives under the National Environmental Policy Act, under NEPA. And I think what you're going to see is a greater acceptance, say, well, if we're going to replace this bridge, an existing facility, again, not new capacity, just a fix it first type mentality, if the bridges, I'm making up the number, 15 feet off the water, do we need to consider alternatives that are 20? And if so, why? And what kind of estimates and modeling will there be to indicate, do there need to be engineering options offered for these sorts of facilities? Similarly,
Yeah.
for coastal roads and highways and rail and transit projects, what sort of protections do there need to be to the track infrastructure to protect it from additional rain or flooding or wind or things of that nature? So I think from a very practical standpoint, folks don't have to get into the debate over climate change to realize that they want the things that they're building and repairing to last.
And are you seeing any new or creative strategies for determining which projects should go forward? Because as I'm sure you know, over the years, transportation and infrastructure projects have been derisively referred to as pork, because they're generally the ones that go forward are those districts where the congressperson is most powerful. Are there new ways going forward where we could actually determine which are the best projects to spend a limited amount of money on?
Yeah, definitely so. And I think the proposal reinforces a portion of the Highway Trust Fund calculus that was first put in MAP 21, which is called performance management. So the whole notion of performance management is you take the major aspects of any surface transportation program, congestion relief, safety, environment, economic development, and so forth, and you take a survey within each state about what do we need? Where are we coming short? Are there some issues with regard to safety and freight delivery, for example? In which case, then maybe doing a truck stop program could be a huge priority. Are there other states where congestion in major metropolitan areas is the biggest thing, in which case reinforcing or providing better capacity or engineering improvements to help the flow of traffic, that could be a priority. So if the states really enhance and stick with the performance management system, that is the most sort of politically neutral way to identify these are our highest needs and we should devote money here. It tries to prevent, I don't know how successful, but it tries to prevent the scenario where there's a terrible safety shortfall in a particular state and all of a sudden they're building new capacity over here, right? Yeah. It's trying to identify the needs and spend the money where the needs are.
So just real quickly, just as our takeaway here, it sounds like I hear you saying that at least in the short term, don't expect much from this year. Going forward, certainly we're going to need something, but you're pretty pessimistic about the prospects of short-term action on any real viable infrastructure funding proposal.
Yeah, I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I'd put $1 on the continuing resolution, continuing a CR, just to get us past the expiration of the current funding bill, which is at the end of September. I think you're going to see that likely through past the inauguration. So my best guess would be a solid 6-month extension from the end of September into March of 2021, in which case either the existing administration as reconstituted or new administration would have the opportunity to work with the new Congress to move something forward more comprehensively.
Right. And so the great debate over infrastructure in this nation continues. Fred Wagner, thank you for helping us to understand where it is today and where it might go in the future. Thanks very much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
And Robert, just one last thing. Just don't ever call it Infrastructure Week. The one way.
Well, we celebrate it 1 week a year, and then we can forget about it the other 51. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, it's a curse. It's a curse to people who care about infrastructure to call it that. So
maybe we can have an infrastructure month. We can stretch it a little bit.
I think that's better.
All right. Thanks a lot, Fred Wagner. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.